I'm Marissa Lane, 29, and the night a doctor warned me my grandfather might not make it till morning, I booked the first flight home with shaking hands and a carry-on packed like a prayer. The ICU lights at St. Magnolia Memorial washed everything in a late-night hush, all beeps and careful footsteps, and the man who taught me to hold a hammer lay motionless beneath tubes and tape. I called my father from the hallway, hoping to hear we're on the road, and instead he laughed over the sound of surf, said the resort had a no-refund policy, and told me to keep them posted. I pressed my back to the vending machine and listened to the can rattle down like a clock hitting empty. I went back to the bed and wrapped my fingers around Grandpa's cool knuckles, counting his breaths, counting mine, promising him out loud that I wasn't leaving. By midnight, the vent sighed like a tired tide, and the floor nurse tucked a thin blanket over my shoulders, as if that could steady the worry. Before dawn, I recited an old poem he loved because I needed a language that didn't wobble. By sunrise, I understood something simple and heavy. Love is who shows up, not who signs the guest book. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand by someone when others wouldn't tap like and subscribe, so more folks hear this. I grew up in a small ranch house where kindness wasn't a speech, but a habit. Thank you notes on the counter tools cleaned before dinner, and doors held open for whomever trailed behind. Arthur Lane, my grandfather, stitched those rules into daily life. He let me sand the first bookshelf I ever built, even though I was 10 and far too proud of crooked edges. When my parents worked late or argued about money, Grandpa filled the quiet with tasks that made sense measured twice cut once. Leave a space better than you found it. I took that with me to Austin, where I make homes feel like they remember their owners, where a door swing and a sunbeam can mean a room finally lets you breathe. The city runs on deadlines and invoices, but I kept the old rhythm: start early, tell the truth, admit when the paint isn't right. My world was modest and steady, a little apartment with a west-facing window and a basil plant that recovered every time I forgot to water it. It wasn't fancy, not like the vacations and club dinners my parents preferred, but it was mine, and it was honest. The flight to Georgia felt longer than it was a restless shuffle of gate changes and coffee that tasted like cardboard, and I landed with a phone that buzzed at the wrong moments. My sister Brianna had posted a photo of their hotel balcony, glossy ocean-tall drinks matching shirts, as if the caption family time could stitch the distance between a beach chair and an ICU hallway. I didn't comment. The elevator doors opened and closed like someone else's story, while I signed forms clipped on a visitor badge and found the room tucked behind a curtain that didn't quite meet the floor. Dr. Ethan Collins reviewed numbers in a voice that never rushed, and I appreciated that almost as much as the nurse who showed me where the extra blankets were kept. The room smelled like antiseptic and worry. I kept my voice low and steady, told Grandpa about the cool front that missed Austin by a day, about the couple who wanted their kitchen island 3 inches too wide, about how the neighbor's cat had started sleeping on my welcome mat. In the overlap between exhaustion and duty, the hospital became a small, stubborn World Vital Signs at 6, a nurse who hummed when she tightened lines, a clock that somehow ran fast and slow at once. When my father returned my call later that evening, he sounded like a man whose biggest problem was sunscreen. He told me he trusted me to keep an eye on things, that I always handled these sorts of details, and that we'd talk when they were back. I wanted to say this wasn't a punch list. This was the man who cut my pancakes into quarters and slipped $1 into my coat pocket every time I nailed a math test, but the words stayed where the air was thin. I learned the way the monitor changed pitch when a nurse adjusted a setting. I learned that an extra pillow under Grandpa's shoulder eased the tension along his jaw. I learned that reciting the first lines of a poem could settle my own hands. When the floor quieted, I would read from an old book I kept in my tote pages soft with handling and pretend the sound of my voice hung pictures back on empty walls. The contrast between the life my parents curated and the one I chose sharpened in that fluorescent light. Their things were staged and framed here, they simply had to be done. I didn't envy them the ocean view. I envied how easy it was for them to look away. I thought about the years my grandfather had stretched $1 into grace, the times he took extra work and never mentioned it. The afternoons he watched me draw rooms on graph paper and said the lines made sense even when they didn't. My mother texted a string of hearts and a reminder to drink water, and I stared at the screen until it dimmed. I believed in repair because he taught me to. I believed in showing up because he always did. Standing at the foot of his bed, I decided that if he drifted anywhere, it would not be alone, and if he found his way back, the first face he would see would be mine. By the third night, I measured time in the length of a poem and the space between nurse rounds, and I failed at sleeping in a chair that squeaked when I breathed. Near dawn, I watched the shadows along the curtain hem grow soft and thought about taking him home when the doctors allowed it, about opening windows, airing out the rooms, setting his favorite mug by the sink. I pictured the garden he kept, the wind chimes he hung to catch every light breeze, the porch boards that creaked where he always stepped twice. The thought steadied me. The thought hurt. And just as the light lifted the edges of the room, something happened that changed the way I counted time, the way I listened for a sound only he could make, something small enough to miss and large enough to reorder the day, and it sent me looking for answers none of them on the beach had bothered to seek. The morning after that faint movement of my grandfather's hand, the air inside the ICU felt different, lighter, in a way I couldn't name. His eyes didn't open that day, but the faint squeeze had been real. I stayed beside him for hours, holding on to that moment, as proof that somewhere inside the tangle of tubes and quiet machines he was fighting to stay. Nurses came and went with soft smiles that said they hoped too, but I never left his side long enough to see daylight. When evening settled, I told him about the thunderstorms predicted over Austin, how the heat always cracked after a storm, and how I missed hearing him say that the smell of rain was the scent of mercy. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a text pinging. It was from Brianna. "Family time." Finally, the caption read. Attached was a photo my parents and sister grinning in front of a blue ocean waves glittering behind them. They wore matching shirts, drinks in hand, sunburnt and smiling. I stared at the picture until my throat felt tight. Grandpa's monitors blinked beside me, steady and cold. I typed back, "He still hasn't woken up. His blood pressure dropped this morning. Can you come back?" My message showed read, but no reply came. That afternoon I called Dad. When he answered, the sound of wind and laughter drifted through the line. "Vic, what's going on?" he asked, using the nickname I hadn't heard since college. "He's not okay," I said quietly. "The doctor says it's critical. He might not make it through the weekend." My father sighed. "Marissa, we talked about this. Everything's paid for. You're there, right? That's what matters. Keep me updated." His tone was calm, like we were talking about a delayed flight instead of the man who raised us both. I pressed the phone closer. "He needs you here," I said. "You should see him." There was a pause, then another sigh. "I'm not canceling this trip. It's been a rough year and your mother needs a break. We'll stop by when we're back." The line went quiet after that. When I hung up, I felt smaller than I had in years. That night, I sat beside Grandpa's bed, scrolling through Brianna's posts. Another beach photo, a dinner spread, a smiling caption that read, "Family is everything." The irony settled heavy in my chest. I looked at the frail man sleeping in front of me, the one who built our home from the ground up, who never missed a single school play or Christmas morning, and I whispered, "You still have me." The days blurred together after that. Mornings began with the hiss of oxygen and the nurses' quiet greetings. Evenings ended with the rhythm of machines echoing through the dim room. I spoke to him every day, telling him small things, how the basil in my kitchen window had finally sprouted again, how the neighbor's dog barked at nothing, how the new design client wanted a library shaped like a hexagon. I needed him to hear my voice, even if it only reached the edge of dreams. Dr. Collins stopped by each morning, checking charts, his tone steady but cautious. "He's holding on," he said more than once. "That's a good sign." I nodded, because believing in small signs was all I had left. The world outside the hospital windows went on. People carried coffee cars, filled the lot. Sunlight moved across linoleum, like a reminder that time doesn't wait. One afternoon, while the nurse adjusted his IV line, she glanced at me and said softly, He's lucky to have someone here. Most folks don't. I thanked her, but inside the word lucky felt wrong. It wasn't luck. It was duty wrapped in love, the kind that doesn't take vacations. By the 11th night, sleep felt like a rumor. I sat in that same chair watching the dim screen of my phone until my eyes blurred. I wanted to believe he could feel the warmth of my hand or hear the rhythm of my voice. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the house he built sunlight through lace curtains, the smell of sawdust, his radio playing old country songs. I woke to the sound of the ventilator's steady hum and realized I'd been crying. The 12th morning began quietly. I opened his favorite book of poems, the leather one he kept in his study, and began reading out loud, my voice scratchy from too many sleepless nights. Halfway through the line about promises to keep, I felt it again, a faint, deliberate squeeze around my fingers. My heart stopped. I looked down, breath caught in my throat. His eyes fluttered open, hazy but alive. "Grandpa," I whispered. His gaze shifted toward me, unfocused but present. "It's me, Marissa. You're safe." A tear slid down my cheek before I could stop it. I pressed the call button, and within seconds, nurses filled the room. Words tumbled around me, responsive, stabilizing, "Get Dr. Collins." I just kept holding his hand. When the room finally cleared, I leaned close. "You came back," I whispered. His fingers moved once, just enough for me to know he understood. Later that day, after the tests and notes and cautious smiles, I stepped into the hallway and called my dad again. "He's awake," I said as soon as he answered. "This morning." He opened his eyes. There was a pause long enough for me to hope. Then he said, "That's great, Marissa. I'm glad. We've only got a couple of days left here, though. Let him rest. We'll visit when we get back." I felt my throat close. "He almost died," I said quietly. "You weren't here." My father's reply was flat. "And you were. That's enough." The call ended before I could respond. I walked back to the room and found Grandpa sleeping again. The lines on his face softened. I sat beside him and whispered, "They're not coming, but I'm here." The air was cool, the hum of machines steady, and for the first time in days, I felt a fragile kind of peace. Over the next week, the doctors adjusted his care. He started breathing on his own, then sitting up with help. "Dr. Collins told me he'd be ready for discharge soon. He'll need therapy and full-time assistance," he said. I didn't hesitate. "I'll handle it." On the morning he left the hospital, sunlight poured through the front doors as I wheeled him outside. He closed his eyes, taking in the warmth, the breeze catching the silver strands of his hair. "We're going home," I told him. He nodded, though his voice was still weak. Driving down the familiar street felt like exhaling after weeks underwater. The gate was open, the porch came into view, and then something felt off. There was a strange car in the driveway, curtains drawn where they had never been before. My chest tightened as I parked. A young woman opened the front door, startled by our arrival. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. "This is Arthur Lane's home," I said. "I'm his granddaughter." She hesitated, called for someone inside. A man appeared holding a coffee mug. "I'm sorry," he said. "We bought this place last week." The words barely registered. "Who sold it?" I asked. He looked through some papers, then met my eyes. "Greg Lane. Said he had full power of attorney." The world went quiet. Grandpa's hand trembled on the armrest. "My house," he whispered, voice thin as air. I knelt beside him, every word catching in my throat. "I didn't know," I said. The new owners looked stricken, but their sympathy couldn't touch what was gone. The porch had been repainted, the wind chimes removed. The garden where he'd planted roses stood stripped to bare soil. I helped him back into the van without a word. That night, in a small hotel room near downtown Springfield, he sat staring out the window while I stared at the glow of my laptop. The house was gone sold, while he lay unconscious, the money unaccounted for. My father had done it quietly, efficiently, as if it were just another deal. I opened the property records, found his signature, and felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Something inside me shifted from grief to resolve, the kind that doesn't fade overnight. I promised myself he would answer for what he'd done. The next morning, as sunlight pushed through the thin curtains, Grandpa whispered, "Where do we go now?" I looked at him and said, "Somewhere we can start over." But inside, another thought was already taking shape. First, I'm going to find the truth. That night in the hotel, sleep never came. I sat at the small desk with my laptop glowing against the dark window, the cursor blinking like it was waiting for me to breathe. Grandpa's breathing was slow and even, the rise and fall of someone too tired to dream. Every now and then he stirred, and I turned toward him just to make sure he was still there. My coffee had gone cold, but I didn't move to refill it. The only thing I could think about was the deed, the way that man had said my father's name, like it was just another cellar in a stack of files. When the sun came up, I still hadn't closed the laptop. I opened the county property records again and stared at the screen. Greg Lane, power of attorney filed 2 years earlier. The same form my father had waved in front of me, once calling it routine paperwork. Back then, I'd barely glanced at it. Now the words meant something entirely different. The document wasn't narrow or limited. It gave him full control of Grandpa's assets, his home accounts, everything. I scrolled down to the sale details and felt my stomach twist. The house had been sold for less than $300,000, half its market value. The buyer paid cash, the transfer was approved, and recorded just 6 days before Grandpa opened his eyes. At 8 in the morning, I called Evelyn Hart, the family's old attorney in Springfield. She'd known Grandpa since before I was born. Her voice came through the line, calm but heavy. "Marissa," she said, "I was afraid you'd learn about this on your own." She confirmed what I already suspected. My father had gone around their firm and handled everything quietly. He'd used a different real estate agent, closed fast, and moved the funds to a personal account. "Can I come in today?" I asked. "Of course," she said. "There's something here you should see." By noon, I'd arranged for Grandpa to stay at a short-term care center near the hotel. The nurse who greeted us was kind, explaining that he'd have a quiet room, meals brought in, and someone nearby if he needed help. When I told him I'd be gone for a few hours, he nodded without protest. "Go," he said softly. "Find out what happened." I kissed his forehead before leaving, promising I'd be back before dinner. Evelyn's office was tucked inside an old brick building near the courthouse square. She met me in the lobby with a folder already in her hands. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, and she looked at me the way someone does when they've known your family too long to pretend surprise. She guided me into a conference room and set the folder on the table. "This is the original power of attorney," she said. "Your grandfather signed it here in this office. I advised against granting full authority, but he insisted. He trusted your father completely." I opened the folder. Grandpa's handwriting was shaky but familiar. I traced the line where he'd signed, then flipped through to the last page. $295,000, I read aloud. "That's at least $150 under market." Evelyn nodded. "It was a cash deal. No appraisal, no inspection period, just a quick close." She slid another paper across the table, a printed bank record showing the wired funds. Every cent had gone straight into my father's checking account. Not a trust, not a joint account, just him. I sat there for a moment staring at the black and white proof. "He sold it while Grandpa was unconscious," I said quietly, "and he used the money for himself." Evelyn's eyes softened. "It's technically legal, Marissa. The power of attorney allows him that control, but if we can prove exploitation or abuse of fiduciary duty, there's a path to challenge it." She hesitated. "It won't be simple." "I don't care if it's simple," I said. "I just want him to answer for it." She nodded once. "Then we start with the demand letter." That night back at the hotel, I wrote it with her help. Every detail was listed: the date of sale, the authority granted, the value discrepancy, the transfer of funds, the lack of consent. I read it twice before sending it to my father's email. The message was formal and cold, giving him 10 days to return the full amount or face legal action. My hands shook when I pressed send, but when the email disappeared from the screen, I felt a strange kind of calm settle in. The next evening, while I was helping Grandpa drink water at the care center, my phone rang. I stepped into the hallway before answering. "Are you out of your mind?" My father's voice snapped through the speaker. "Hello, Dad," I said quietly. "A lawsuit against your own father over a house over a betrayal," I corrected. He let out a harsh laugh. "Don't get dramatic. Everything I did was legal. That house was falling apart. I sold it for everyone's good. Everyone's, I asked. Or just yours? There was silence. Then his tone sharpened. You think I stole from him? You think I'm some kind of thief? I don't think I said. I have records. For a long moment, all I heard was his breathing. Then he said low and cold, Go ahead. Sue me. But don't call me your father again. The line went dead. I stood there, phone still in my hand, listening to the quiet hum of the hallway. Inside the room, Grandpa had drifted back to sleep, his hand resting loosely on the blanket. I wanted to tell him I was sorry for believing that family always meant safety, but I didn't want to wake him. The next morning, my mother called. Her voice trembled, but not from sadness. Why are you doing this to us, Marissa? You're tearing the family apart. I'm protecting Grandpa, I said. He trusted you. He trusted all of you. It's just a house, she said. You've turned it into a war. It was his life, I answered, and he didn't get to say goodbye to it. That afternoon, Brianna texted me. You're seriously embarrassing us. If you're mad at Dad, fine. But taking him to court, that's low. I didn't reply. The distance between us had already been built. Later that day, when I returned to the care center, Grandpa was awake and sitting by the window. The late sunlight touched the side of his face, and he turned toward me as I entered. They've stopped calling, I said quietly, sitting beside him. He nodded, eyes clear but tired. Then he reached for my hand and said, You're not alone. Those 3 words settled something deep inside me. For the first time since the hospital, I believed we could win. Over the next week, Evelyn worked quickly. She gathered statements, collected copies of bank transfers, and reached out to the notary Caleb Price, who had witnessed the signing. He remembered the day vividly, how my father had rushed the process, how Grandpa looked confused and tired, how he hadn't been given time to read the full document. That testimony would matter. The hearing date came faster than I expected. Tuesday morning, 10 o'clock, Springfield County Courthouse. I wore a navy suit and kept my hair tied back. It wasn't about appearances. It was about focus. Evelyn met me outside carrying 2 thick folders. We're ready, she said. Inside, my father was already seated with his attorney, a man named Brent Daniels. My mother and Brianna sat behind them, avoiding my eyes. Grandpa was wheeled in by a nurse, his posture frail but steady. When he saw me, he smiled faintly, and that was enough to quiet the tremor in my hands. Judge Teresa Nolan entered firm and composed. Let's begin, she said. Evelyn opened with clarity, her voice strong but respectful. She explained that Greg Lane had sold his father's home, while the man lay unconscious in intensive care, used a sweeping power of attorney to authorize the sale and transferred every dollar into a personal account. This was not an act of care, she said. It was an act of self-interest. When my turn came, I stood and spoke directly to the judge. For 13 days, I sat beside my grandfather while he lay on life support. My father was at the beach, and when I brought Grandpa home, his house was gone. My voice wavered once, but I kept going. He didn't just sell a property, he erased a lifetime. Brent Daniels stood next, his tone smooth and practiced. The power of attorney was valid. Your Honor, my client acted within his rights to ensure his father's long-term care. This was a difficult but responsible decision. Then Caleb Price took the stand. He adjusted his glasses and said, Mr. Lane was in a hurry that day. William looked exhausted. I asked if he understood what he was signing, but his son interrupted and said, He trusts me. I regret not pushing harder. The courtroom fell quiet. Evelyn presented the final piece, a bank statement showing every dollar of the sale sitting untouched in Greg Lane's personal account. No medical expenses, no care fund. Just money waiting. Judge Nolan listened without expression, then said she'd issue a ruling in 2 weeks. The gavel struck once, and it was done for the day. Outside the courthouse, the sky hung heavy and gray. Grandpa sat in his wheelchair beside me, looking at nothing in particular. My mother and sister passed us on their way to the parking lot. Brianna paused, her voice low. Was it worth it? Before I could answer, Grandpa spoke. Yes. I turned toward him, surprised, but he didn't look at me. He just watched the courthouse doors close behind them. We wheeled to the car in silence. The rain began as a drizzle, quiet and persistent, the kind that feels like it's washing something away. And as I helped him into the seat, I felt the first hint of what was coming. Justice had a slow rhythm, but it was finally starting to move. 2 weeks after the hearing, the courthouse felt smaller in my memory than it had that morning. I could still hear the echo of the judge's gavel, see my father's expression, a practiced calm that didn't reach his eyes. Evelyn said it would take time for a ruling that judges in Springfield preferred to deliberate thoroughly before writing a decision. Still, every hour of waiting felt like a year. Grandpa and I stayed in the small hotel downtown where the window looked out onto a narrow street lined with maple trees that hadn't quite turned for fall. He spent most mornings reading short articles from the newspaper aloud, his voice still weak but steady, while I checked emails and kept my phone nearby. When the call finally came, it was mid-afternoon. Evelyn's number flashed across the screen. I put it on speaker and sat beside Grandpa. "Judge Nolan's decision just came through," she said. "Would you like me to read it?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Her voice carried the rhythm of words chosen carefully, each one deliberate. While the power of attorney remains legally valid, the actions taken by Mr. Greg Lane, specifically the sale of the principal's residence during his incapacitation and the transfer of proceeds into a personal account, constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. I exhaled slowly, gripping the arm of the chair as she continued. "The court orders full restitution of the sale amount, $295,000, plus $150,000 for undervaluing the property. The power of attorney is hereby revoked, and a written statement of accountability must be filed with the county." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. Grandpa looked over at me, his eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks. "I didn't think anyone would ever fight for me," he said quietly. I reached for his hand and squeezed it. "You fought for me first," I said. Evelyn met us the next day to review the paperwork. The funds would take a few weeks to transfer, but the ruling was final. My father could appeal, though Evelyn doubted he would. The evidence was too clean, she said. He'd lose again. When she left, I sat with Grandpa at the small table by the window, both of us quiet. There was relief, yes, but it carried the kind of exhaustion that seeps in when a storm has finally passed. Once the restitution cleared, I started searching for a home. I didn't want to go back to Austin yet, not while Grandpa was still recovering. We needed a place near his doctor's, something calm and bright, a house that felt like breathing after months of tightness. The one we found was a small white cottage on the edge of Springfield, surrounded by wild rose bushes and a backyard shaded by oaks. It wasn't grand, but when we stepped inside, the light poured through the windows like an invitation. By the end of the week, the sale was finalized. I brought in his old armchair, set it by the front window, and hung his wind chimes just outside. The first morning there, I brewed peppermint tea the way he used to for me after school and handed him a cup. He smiled faintly, inhaling the steam. "Smells like home," he said. Our days fell into a gentle rhythm. I worked remotely from the kitchen table drafting blueprints while Grandpa read or rested. In the afternoons, we walked slowly down the garden path, his cane tapping against the stones, the sound mixing with birdsong. He was quieter than before, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet. The tension that had shadowed his face in the hospital had softened. Sometimes I caught him watching the trees outside his eyes, reflecting the branches. "Do you miss it?" I asked one evening as the sun dipped low behind the house. He shook his head. "That house was just wood and nails. What I miss is what we built inside it." A few weeks later, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find my mother and Brianna standing on the porch, holding a small gift box wrapped in gold ribbon. The air between us felt fragile. My mother's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We wanted to see him," she said, "just for a few minutes." I hesitated but stepped aside. Grandpa was sitting in his chair reading the paper. When they entered, he looked up calm and composed. Brianna placed the box on the table. "We brought cookies," she said softly. He nodded, then folded his paper and set it down. "I'm not angry," he said, "but I'm awake now." The room went still. My mother's shoulders dropped, and for a second she looked older than I remembered. "We should go," she said, and they left without another word. That night, as I washed the teacups, I could still hear his words echoing. He wasn't angry. He was awake. It wasn't forgiveness, it was understanding, and it was enough. Winter crept in quietly that year. The rose bushes faded to bare stems, and frost formed on the kitchen window each morning. Grandpa grew stronger, walking farther each day. Sometimes he sat at the table and helped me sketch small design ideas. "Houses need a heartbeat," he'd say, tapping the paper. "Something worth staying for." In the evenings, I read while he worked on crosswords, and the house filled with a comfort I hadn't felt in months. The past was still there, but it no longer ruled the room. A year after the verdict, the garden was in full bloom again. Grandpa sat under the oak tree with a glass of lemonade, the same wind chimes swaying above him. I joined him, setting down a tray of tea between us. "Hard to believe it's been a year," I said. "It feels longer." He smiled, watching the light shift through the branches. "That's how peace works," he said. "It stretches time." Sometimes when the wind picked up, the chimes carried through the yard, soft and steady. I thought of the hospital's cold lights, the empty house, the long nights spent waiting for him to open his eyes. Those memories still lived in me, but now they sat beside the sound of wind through leaves and the warmth of sunlight on old wood. I looked toward the horizon, the fields beyond the fence glowing in the late afternoon light, and realized that the story wasn't about what we lost. It was about what we reclaimed. The house we lived in now might not have been the one he built decades ago, but it was ours, made of small choices and second chances. Every nail, every board, every breeze through the open window carried proof that some things once broken can still be rebuilt. As I closed the gate that evening, I noticed the mailbox flag had been raised. Inside was a single envelope addressed in my father's handwriting. I turned it over once, then slipped it into my pocket without opening it. Some answers I knew could wait. The porch light flicked on as the sky deepened to gray. Grandpa called from inside, asking if I wanted another cup of tea. I smiled, closing the door behind me. Tomorrow I would decide what to do next, but tonight the world was quiet, and that was enough. The envelope sat on my nightstand for 3 days before I opened it. It was my father's handwriting, careful, deliberate, like he'd taken time to make it neat. I knew every loop of his cursive from old birthday cards and permission slips he used to sign when I was in school. I waited until a quiet morning to finally read it. Grandpa was outside trimming the rose bushes, the sound of his shears steady and sure, when I slit the envelope open with a butter knife and unfolded the letter inside. It wasn't long. Just a few paragraphs. He wrote that he'd complied with the court's ruling, that restitution had been paid in full, and that he hoped I'd found peace in whatever this had been. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. The last line simply read, "I'll be in touch when the time feels right." I folded it back along the crease and set it on the kitchen counter, unsure what to do with it. The kettle clicked off behind me, and the smell of peppermint filled the air. When Grandpa came in wiping his hands on a rag, he saw the letter and nodded once. "He wrote, didn't he?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "but it's just words." He poured himself a cup of tea and leaned against the counter. "Then let's stop giving his silence a chair at the table." I knew what he meant. It wasn't anger anymore. It was acceptance that some people never look back until there's nothing left to see. The next few months passed quietly. My design work picked up again. Clients called from Austin, and I started taking remote projects, sketching floor plans at the small desk by the cottage window. Grandpa settled into a routine that made the house hum with life-watering plants, feeding the stray cat that had claimed our porch, humming while he read the paper. One afternoon in early spring, I drove into town to pick up supplies. The courthouse lawn was dotted with new azaleas, and the cafe across from it had put tables outside for the first warm week of the year. As I crossed the street, I heard someone call my name. When I turned, Evelyn Hart was waving from a table, a cup of coffee beside her. "Marissa," she said warmly when I approached, "how are you two holding up?" "We're all right," I said. "Grandpa's stronger every week. He's even planning to rebuild a small shed out back." She smiled the kind of proud, tired smile that comes from seeing too many families fight over what should have been love. "I'm glad," she said. "And Greg hasn't tried to appeal. That's something." "Has he said anything to you?" I asked. "Not directly," she replied. "He sent a copy of his statement to the county clerk, a short one. Just acknowledgement of the ruling. It's done." I thanked her and started to leave, but she stopped me with a hand on my arm. You did right by him, she said. It takes strength to stand up to your own. Driving home, her words lingered, though they didn't feel like victory. What I'd done hadn't been about winning, it had been about drawing a line where trust had been erased. That night, as the sun sank low, Grandpa sat on the porch while I watered the garden. He pointed to the oak tree near the back fence. "Do you hear that?" he asked. The wind had picked up, stirring the chimes I'd hung there months before. "Sounds like home again," he said quietly. We spent most evenings like that, tea on the porch, the smell of earth and roses, the soft rasp of the wind through the trees. Sometimes I caught myself looking at the mailbox, half expecting another envelope. It stayed empty. One morning in May, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was my mother's. "Your father's been asking about you," she said. "He wants to talk." I didn't respond at first. She rushed to fill the silence. "He's not well, Marissa. Blood pressure stress, it's catching up to him. Maybe it's time to let things settle." I looked toward the living room where Grandpa was reading under the morning light. "We're settled," I said softly. "He made his choices. He's still your father," she whispered. "I know," I said. "And he's still the man who sold his father's house while he was in a hospital bed." She sighed, tired and small. "I just thought you should know." The line went quiet. I told Grandpa about the call that evening. He nodded thoughtfully, not surprised. "You don't owe him the version of peace he wants," he said. "Some people only come knocking when the house you built looks warm." The next few weeks brought small, ordinary joys. Grandpa's physical therapist cleared him for short walks downtown, so every Thursday we visited the farmers market. He liked to talk with the stall owners, asking about their gardens and recipes. I watched him barter for tomatoes with the same quiet determination he'd once used to teach me carpentry. One Saturday we passed a local art fair. A booth displayed framed photographs of restored houses and barns. Grandpa stopped to look. "See that one?" he said, pointing to a picture of an old farmhouse with new siding and bright shutters. "That's what you did for me." I smiled, though my throat felt tight. "It's what you did for me first," I said. By midsummer, the days grew long and golden. The garden flourished. The roses he'd trimmed in March now climbed the fence, spilling over in soft pink waves. One afternoon, as I worked on a design draft inside, I heard the chimes ringing sharply in the wind. When I looked out, Grandpa was standing by the gate, his hand resting on it like he was waiting for something. I stepped onto the porch. "Everything okay?" I called. He turned slightly, his expression unreadable. "Just thinking," he said, "about how far we've come." That evening we sat outside until the first fireflies appeared. He told me stories about his childhood, the fishing trips with his brother, the tiny workshop he'd built behind his first house, the nights he'd stayed up repairing furniture after everyone else had gone to bed. He laughed quietly at the memory of my father as a boy tagging along eager to help. "He wasn't always this way," Grandpa said softly. But somewhere he forgot the weight of a promise. A few days later another envelope arrived. This one was postmarked from out of state. Inside was a single page with my father's handwriting, again smaller this time. "I don't expect you to forgive me," it read. "But I'm sorry. I hope you and your grandfather are well." I folded the note and placed it in the drawer beside the first. There was no anger left in me, just a quiet understanding that closure doesn't always arrive in full sentences. That night, as rain tapped lightly on the roof, Grandpa sat near the window, watching the storm. The garden lights flickered, reflecting in his eyes. "You know," he said, "storms clear the air, even when they make a mess first." I looked out with him, the sound of rain steady and calm. "Yeah," I said, "they do." The next morning the world smelled new, the earth darker, the leaves washed clean. I walked to the mailbox barefoot, the grass still damp under my feet. There was nothing inside, just the hollow echo of peace, settling where tension used to live. Inside, Grandpa was already making tea. "Morning," he said, handing me a cup. I smiled, sitting down beside him. The wind moved through the chimes again, low and soft. For the first time, it didn't sound like memory. It sounded like beginning. The season ahead felt wide open, but somewhere deep down, I knew change would come again. It always did. And this time, whatever came next, we'd face it together. By late summer, the air in Springfield carried that heavy sweetness that came just before harvest. The roses along our fence had thinned, but their scent still drifted through the open windows in the evenings. Life had settled into something calm, something real. Grandpa's health held steady. He moved slower, but each step carried purpose, watering the garden, sanding an old wooden stool he wanted to refinish before winter. It felt like the quiet after years of noise, though part of me kept waiting for the echo of something unresolved. It arrived one Friday morning in early September. A letter came from a law office in Sarasota, Florida. The envelope was thick, embossed with a firm seal I didn't recognize. I opened it slowly, my heart thudding as my eyes moved across the first page. It was from my father's attorney. He'd been hospitalized after what the letter called a cardiovascular episode, and his affairs needed attention. My name was listed as emergency contact. I read it twice before setting it down. Grandpa looked up from his chair near the window. "Something wrong?" he asked. I hesitated, then handed him the letter. He read silently, his mouth a firm line. "You don't have to go," he said finally. "You've already done enough." I stood there unsure. It wasn't duty that made me consider going. It was something quieter, a tug I couldn't name. "If I don't," I said softly, "I'll always wonder what he'd have said if I did." 2 days later, I boarded a flight to Sarasota. The hospital there looked nothing like the one that had held our worst memories. It was new and glassy light streaming through wide halls that smelled faintly of lemon and disinfectant. The nurse at the desk led me to a private room where my father lay propped up against a mountain of white pillows. He looked smaller, thinner. His hair had gone grayer than I remembered. When he opened his eyes, surprise flickered through them before fading to something like relief. "You came," he said. His voice was rough. I nodded, pulling up a chair. "Mom called," I said. "She told me you were here." He studied me for a long moment. "I wasn't sure you'd ever want to see me again." I looked down at my hands. I wasn't sure either. The silence between us was strange, layered with years that hadn't been kind. Finally, he spoke again. "I read your deposition after the hearing," he said quietly. "Every word. I didn't realize how much I'd lost until I saw it all in black and white. I didn't do it to punish you," I said. "I did it because it was wrong." He nodded faintly. "I know that now." For a while, neither of us spoke. The monitors beside his bed beeped softly, marking time, in a language that had nothing to do with forgiveness. He closed his eyes again, breathing slow. When he spoke next, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't sell the house for the money, you know. I thought I could handle his care, keep control of everything. I was wrong. I thought being right mattered more than being kind. I listened, but said nothing. Sometimes truth doesn't need an answer, it just needs to land." When I left the hospital that evening, the Florida air felt heavier than I expected, thick with salt and heat. I sat in my rental car for a long time before starting the engine. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger either, just an ache for all the time that had been spent on pride instead of love. Back in Springfield, Grandpa was waiting on the porch when I arrived home 2 days later. The sun had already set the porch light, casting a warm circle around his chair. "You went," he said simply. "I did," I said. "He's not well." But he said, "He knows now." Grandpa nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's something." That night after he went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank piece of paper in front of me. I started to write, not to my father, but to myself. I wrote about the hospital smell, the way his hands trembled when he spoke, the hollow sound of regret that doesn't change what's already done. I folded the page and tucked it into a drawer beside his letters. Days turned into weeks, and the season shifted again. The evenings cooled, and we started keeping the windows closed after dark. Grandpa began teaching me how to carve small wooden boxes, his fingers steady over the blade, even when mine slipped. "Patience is half the work," he'd say. "The wood will tell you when it's ready." One afternoon I received another letter, this time, not from a lawyer, but from my mother. It was shorter than any she'd ever written. She said Dad had been released, that they were moving back to Georgia to be closer to family, and that she hoped someday we could talk without old wounds between us. I read it twice, then set it beside the others. A few days later, Brianna called. It had been almost a year since we'd spoken on the phone. "Mom said you saw Dad," she said cautiously. "I did," I replied. How was he older? I said, quieter. She hesitated before asking, "Do you hate us, Marissa?" The question caught me off guard. "No," I said finally. "I just stopped trying to make sense of what isn't mine to fix." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I miss Grandpa." "He'd like to hear that," I said. "You can call him anytime." That night after dinner, I told Grandpa about the call. He smiled a slow, careful smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "People find their way back when they're ready," he said. "All we can do is keep the porch light on." The following weekend, I planted new roses by the fence line, their petals a soft coral color that caught the evening light. Grandpa watched from his chair, offering gentle advice on spacing and soil. The air was cool, the sky streaked pink and gold. As I worked, I thought about the long path that had led us here, the hospital corridors, the courthouse steps, the letters written and unread. When I finally stood to stretch, Grandpa pointed toward the horizon. "See that?" he said. "Sunset always looks the same, no matter where you are. Maybe that's the world's way of reminding us to let go." I followed his gaze, the sky deepening into the first shades of night. For the first time, I understood what he meant. The past wasn't something to erase, it was something to outgrow. Later, as I closed the curtains, I caught the faint sound of the wind chimes outside. The same soft melody that had once hung outside his old porch now drifted through our new one. I smiled, realizing the sound had changed only because the wind had. The next morning, an email from Evelyn arrived. She mentioned a small community program starting in Springfield, volunteers helping seniors repair their homes before winter. "They could use someone with your eye for design," she wrote. I looked over at Grandpa sipping his coffee by the window, and something inside me settled. It felt like the next step, quiet, simple but true. "I think I'll do it," I said aloud. Grandpa looked up. "Then do it," he said. "That's how you start the next chapter." Outside, the morning light spilled across the porch, soft and golden, stretching over the roses we'd planted together. It felt like the kind of peace that doesn't erase what came before, it just gives it somewhere gentle to rest. And though I didn't know what the next season would bring, I knew this: whatever change came, we had already built something solid enough to hold it. The morning I started volunteering at the Springfield Community Home Project, the air was crisp enough to carry the scent of sawdust from half a block away. The old warehouse on Birch Street had been turned into a workshop filled with half-built railings, ladders, and paint-stained tables. When I walked in, a man with a clipboard and kind eyes greeted me. "You must be Marissa," he said, offering a gloved hand. "Henry Walsh. I run this little circus." His handshake was firm, steady, the kind you trust immediately. He gave me a quick tour: stacks of lumber leaning against one wall, bins of nails and brushes, and a whiteboard covered in addresses of homes that needed repair before winter. "We've got more requests than hands," Henry said with a wry smile, "but that's how you know you're doing something that matters." The first house we visited belonged to an elderly woman named Mrs. Whitlow, who lived alone on the south side of town. Her porch steps had rotted through, and her screen door hung crooked on one hinge. I spent that afternoon sketching simple blueprints for the railing, while Henry and 2 volunteers pried away loose boards. Mrs. Whitlow made us sweet tea and sat in a rocking chair telling stories about her late husband who'd built the house in 1968. By the time we finished, she stood at the doorway, her eyes wet with gratitude. "You folks didn't just fix my porch," she said. "You brought my home back." That evening I came home covered in sawdust and sunlight. Grandpa was at the kitchen table with his crossword puzzle. "Looks like you've been fighting with a forest," he said, smiling. I laughed and poured us both some tea. "You'd love it there," I told him. "You can smell the cedar before you even step inside." He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "It suits you," he said, "building things that last." As the weeks passed, the project became part of my rhythm. On Mondays and Thursdays, I met Henry and the team at sunrise, and we worked until the light turned gold and slanted. We repaired handrails, replaced windows, repainted door frames. It wasn't glamorous work, but it felt good, the kind of tired that sleeps easy at night. Henry had a calm way of leading, never raising his voice, always finding humor in splintered wood or crooked measurements. Sometimes we'd drive back from a site in comfortable silence, the hum of the truck engine filling the space where words weren't needed. One afternoon as we loaded supplies, Henry glanced over. "You ever think about teaching what you know?" he asked. "Design or carpentry?" I asked, smiling. "Both," he said. "We've been trying to start a youth apprenticeship, high schoolers who could use real-world skills. You'd be great with them." The idea stayed with me long after I got home. That night I mentioned it to Grandpa as he stirred a pot of soup. "You'd do well with that," he said. "You learned with your hands before you learned with your head. Kids need that." I set the table and watched the steam rise between us. "You think so?" He nodded. "It's in your blood, Marissa. You come from builders, even if not all of them remembered what that meant." A few days later I called Henry and agreed to help. The program began small, 4 students, 1 borrowed classroom, and a pile of scrap wood. The first morning I spread out a set of plans on the table and said, "These lines might look simple, but they hold a person's trust. Every wall, every joint, every corner tells a story about care." The kids listened, their hands fidgeting with pencils and tape measures. But when they started building their first frame, the focus in their faces reminded me of myself at that age, eager to make something solid out of chaos. By late autumn, the days grew shorter, and the wind carried a chill that hinted at winter. Grandpa came to visit the workshop one morning, leaning on his cane as he watched the students sand their boards. They greeted him like he was family. "That's Mr. Lane," Henry said, introducing him. "The man who taught Marissa how to use a hammer." Grandpa smiled shyly, his eyes bright with pride. On the drive home, he looked out at the rolling fields. "I see what you've built here," he said quietly. "It's more than houses." We stopped for coffee at a diner along the highway. The waitress refilled our cups twice before Grandpa spoke again. "When your father was your age, he used to help me with small jobs, fences, decks, whatever the neighbors needed. He had the touch for it. I never thought he'd lose it." I stared at the coffee swirling in my cup. Maybe he forgot what it felt like to work for someone else's good. Grandpa nodded slowly. Maybe. Or maybe he just got lost in the noise. When winter settled in, snow lined the rooftops and the project slowed down. We shifted to indoor repairs, insulation flooring, light fixtures. One of the homes belonged to a young single mother whose heating had gone out. As we installed a new system, I thought of all the nights Grandpa had sat beside his own father, learning how to mend and fix with whatever was at hand. Generations of repair, both seen and unseen. The week before Christmas, a small package arrived at the cottage. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting was my father's. Inside was a wooden box, handmade, polished, and carved with the faint outline of an oak tree. Inside it was a note I found the wind chimes in the old shed. "I thought you should have them. Merry Christmas." I ran my fingers along the grain of the wood. It was imperfect, slightly uneven, but made by hand. Grandpa looked at it for a long time before saying, "He still remembers how." We hung the new box on the mantel beside the fireplace, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as proof that people could change in quiet ways. That night, the first snow of the season began to fall soft and steady. Grandpa and I sat by the window, the glow from the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. He handed me a mug of tea and said, "Your grandmother used to say, peace doesn't come all at once. It drifts in like snowflake by flake until you realize the ground's been covered." Outside the yard turned white, and the old chimes whispered faintly in the wind. When I finally went to bed, I left the window cracked open just enough to hear them. Somewhere beyond that quiet sound, beyond the frost and memory, I felt something shifting like the start of a new rhythm I hadn't known I was waiting for. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the table, catching on the carved oak box. The light felt warmer, somehow steadier, and I realized we had both come through the kind of winter that doesn't end with the season, but with understanding. And though the road behind us was marked with loss and silence, the path ahead seemed clear. Whatever time we had left, it would be spent building not just houses or furniture, but the kind of peace that lasts. Outside, the chimes moved again, soft and low, and I thought they sounded less like memory now and more like promise. Winter softened into spring before I realized how much time had passed. The last of the snow melted from the garden beds, and the first rosebuds began to appear small and stubborn against the chill. The cottage felt different now, not new exactly, but lived in. The rooms carried the scent of cedar and tea, and the light that streamed through the kitchen window in the morning had a calm, familiar warmth to it. Grandpa called it settled light, the kind that finds its own place and stays. The community project grew busier once the weather turned. Henry and I recruited a new batch of volunteers, and our little workshop on Birch Street buzzed again with the sound of hammers and laughter. Grandpa came with me, sometimes sitting in his favorite chair near the door while the students sanded their first boards. He didn't need to say much. His quiet presence was enough to steady everyone around him. Every so often, a student would ask him for advice, and he'd lean forward, patient and kind, explaining that good work wasn't about speed, but about care. In early May, we finished rebuilding the porch of a widow's home on the north side of town. When she stepped outside to see it, she ran her hand along the railing, whispering that it felt like her husband had built it himself. I looked over at Grandpa then, and he was watching her with the same soft expression he'd worn when he saw the cottage for the first time. That quiet moment reminded me why we'd started again, to give back something that had been taken not just from us, but from anyone who'd ever felt powerless. A few weeks later, I received a small envelope postmarked from Georgia. It was from my father. The handwriting looked weaker this time, and the paper trembled where the ink bled through. Inside was a short note that read, "I've been thinking about the things I built and the ones I tore down. I'm glad you chose differently. Take care of him for me." There was no signature, but he didn't need one. I folded the letter and placed it inside the wooden box he'd made at Christmas. Some part of me knew that was the last thing I'd ever receive from him. Life went on quietly after that. Grandpa grew slower that summer, resting more often on the porch, his cane leaning against the railing. Some evenings we didn't talk at all, we just watched the light fade behind the trees. One evening as the sky turned gold, he said, "You did right, you know. You built a life out of the pieces they left behind." I turned toward him, the air thick with the scent of roses. "We did it together," I said. He smiled, his hand resting over mine. That's all I ever hoped for. When he passed later that year, it was gentle, like a candle burning low. He slipped away in his sleep, the morning light just starting to touch the curtains. I sat by his bed holding his hand until it cooled, the house wrapped in a stillness that felt both heavy and sacred. The wind chimes outside stirred softly, their faint melody carrying through the quiet rooms. The weeks that followed were slow and strange. I moved through the motions of sorting his things, his tools, his notebooks, the tiny scraps of wood he'd never thrown away. Among them I found a folded page in his handwriting. It was a list of simple things: keep the porch light on, take care of the garden, teach what you know, don't forget to rest. I read it twice, then pinned it to the wall above my desk. By autumn, the workshop had become a place of steady rhythm and purpose. The youth program now had 12 students, and the walls were lined with sketches and framed photos of every project we'd completed. On the anniversary of Grandpa's passing, we planted a young oak behind the building, its roots wrapped carefully in burlap. As we filled the soil, I thought about the house that had been lost, the courtrooms, the long nights in the hospital, all of it leading to this small, growing thing. Sometimes people ask why I stayed in Springfield instead of going back to Austin. I tell them it's because the work feels honest here. Every nail, every wall, every rebuilt porch carries a story, and I see a little of Grandpa in all of them. I still keep the wind chimes he left behind hanging near the window. When the air moves just right, they ring softly like they did on that first day I brought him home. Looking back, I've learned that justice isn't always a verdict or a courtroom victory. Sometimes it's quieter. It's standing your ground when it would be easier to walk away. It's rebuilding something after it's been broken, not because you expect to be thanked, but because it's the right thing to do. And love, the real kind, doesn't always come wrapped in forgiveness. Sometimes it just means choosing to carry forward the best of what someone gave you, even after they're gone. I still start my mornings the same way: tea, steeping on the counter, sunlight spilling through the window, the chimes singing somewhere just out of view. The house feels peaceful, full of the kind of warmth that only grows when you've earned it. If this story reminds you of someone who taught you how to stand firm, or of a time you found your own strength when no one else showed up, hold that close. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, stay a while, share your thoughts below, and take care of yourself. Because sometimes peace isn't something you find, it's something you build one careful piece at a time.